I would like to say, on behalf of everybody at the Centre Culturel Irlandais, and especially Nora Hickey Msichili, who's the director of the Centre Culturel Irlandais, how delighted we are to all be here in our different countries, be it Ireland, France, or all over the globe, to find out more about les échos toujours plus sourds, wonderful John Joly quotation, one of many references that Alan uses in his exhibition. And in fact, I find it really interesting going around with journalists, because of course they ask you lots of questions that you're like, damn, I don't know the answer. Alan, can you tell me a little bit? You're like, so there's so many layers to the work that I'm carrying on finding out about. And just as far as the French audience is concerned, it's true that even those that are specialized in photography have not necessarily heard of John Joly. And so that kind of historical element pulls them in, intrigues them. And then the way you've turned it into you know, it's become a kind of contemporary reincarnation of it, but with beautiful like little light boxes and everything. It's been a delight showing people around, because for those of you that haven't come yet, do, if you are in the country, or when it perhaps it goes elsewhere in Ireland or abroad, because it is such fun and a delight to look at different angles at the different
I'll explain later. Yes.
So I won't say any more, but one word I think often comes up is re-narrativization. And that's, I think, one word that I would take away from your exhibition, Alan, because it's really interesting how you deploy that. And tonight, Alan's going to be discussing his work with Ruth Carroll, who, as you all know, is curator at the RHA, a gallery that we all love in Paris, in Dublin, one of my favorites, and that we have many connections with. And of course, Folly and Diction, Alan's work was opening around about this time last year. And I know that the two of you have been collaborating a lot in the uprun to that exhibition. So Ruth, take it away.
Hello.
Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Just to say I'm really happy to be doing this. I don't know if everyone's aware, but Alan's show, when we opened, we had a lot of plans to do these online chats and, you know, a couple of workshops and meetings and things like that. And it just was, the timing was really unfortunate, because we were supposed to close it, I think it was in April, Alan, wasn't it? And then of course, first lockdown came. So it's really nice to be here and to talk to Alan about the work finally a year after. So hello, Alan, how are you?
Hello.
Are you good?
I'm good, thank you very much.
Good,
yes.
wonderful.
Thanks for being
Alan,
here.
we were talking about the work. I'm just kind of thinking about where to start. I am thinking, because I'm really aware that a lot of participants on today's Zoom may not have seen the show in Paris because of, with restrictions around travel and museums and things like that. Now, a lot of people may have seen the work possibly in Dublin or in Derry, or the first iteration, which was in the dock. But just for the benefit of people who haven't seen the work, would you mind just describing the exhibition for us kind of briefly?
Okay, well, very briefly, because I'm not going to be showing any pictures or sharing screens, but so there's 15 photographs, 15 Joly Screen photographs, and one 15-minute film. And at the entrance, there's 3 rolls of photographic color film cut into strips, red, green, and blue strips, which is a sort of a little excerpt from a larger 20-meter long version of installation that was in the lab, which was the first place where photographs were shown, where I showed publicly displayed the first Joly photograph.
Yeah.
And what I like to do is include the red, green, and blue coloring in some way in all the installations, in some sort of architectural element or an installation element which refers to the process, which we shall talk about later. But the first photograph that you see in the exhibition is a diptych. It's a flower arrangement split across 2 frames, and the title of the picture is the same sort of process as all the rest of them. It's made up of the reference of an element of the visual reference, the source painting, for example, and then an event in history or culture that coincides with the making of that work. So for this work, for this particular picture, it's a hyper baroque floral arrangement, explosion of flowers. The reason why we split it across two is that it took so long to make, and then it was so large that it looked great across two frames. So it was a nice way to kind of try using multiple frames to fit one photograph. And the title is called Jean-Baptiste Bélin de Fontenay, 1705, when Mirabelle and Millamant were in double abundance. So Jean-Baptiste Bélin de Fontenay is a French painter who specialized in flowers, and 1705 is the date for the painting that it referenced. It's more or less around 1700 or so. Mm-hmm. And then Mirabelle and Millamant is a restoration comedy from the same time by William Congreve, which was from a play called The Way of the World, which is really popular at the time. So there's another narrative that people know, that particular narrative, it sort of relates to the flowers in some way. Well, it does and it doesn't, but it's an event. A lot of the other titles are news events or historically significant events that happened, but then some of them are just quite random cultural things. And so the range of the titles go from French painters through to Ikebana Japanese masters, and then the Red Hot Chili Peppers through to Robert Mapplethorpe and Constance Spry.
Yeah, broad, really
quite broad.
And also the film that was made for RHA, the first showing, that's showing in Paris as well, of course, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. I'm going to go back to the very beginning and just want to talk about, of course, so the work has been shown in lots of different iterations. Firstly, the lab, which I did not remember to speak about, apologies. But let's talk about how this project maybe started, because I think that's kind of interesting. Because just to be aware of the time that we've kind of been talking about this. So I think we began talking about this project in 2017, when we decided to hatch a little plot to make a film for Venice. Do you want to kind of talk about that and maybe how that sort of genesis of an idea has kind of expanded and become, you know, what is now in Paris?
Yeah, I mean, that's why you're listed as the curator on the invite for the show, which I thought was a lovely twist of events, as a full circle in some respects.
Yeah.
So yeah, like it began, I think, with the film, which was initially also supposed to be a multi-channel 5-screen sort of, you know, monstrosity. And it was always, you know, that was to be about John Joly and his photographic process, but and over the subsequent 3 years, then it morphed into several different directions and various funding cycles to become what it is now. But it was always meant to be a music video rather than a documentary about this particular historical process. But with this, so this historical narrative feeding into a popular cultural kind of format and trope of a music video. So I went about that particular process quite dogmatically. So it started with the song in the way that a music video starts with the song and the images come later. The video comes later. It's a promotional tool for selling music, but it's become its own particular visual genre when you think of all the long format videos that exist from, like, for example, Beyonce's Lemonade, for example, that everybody would know. But there's many, many, many artists release full visual albums as well as their musical albums now, the ones that can afford it, who are super well funded and all that rest. So for me, starting with this project, it began quite a long process with a friend, an artist called Ian McInerney, trialing out lots of different types of music. I kind of wanted something that had a dance element, but then the script that I had been working through had lots of different moods, so it had to shift. So we were working through lots of different types of music for quite a while. And then we hooked up with this guy called James Kelly, who's from Cork, who lives in Berlin, who actually does a lot of music for corporate kind of fashion clients as well as electronic music, and he also is a death metal head as well. So he's a really kind of funny mix, but it's apparently quite common. And then that was recorded in Berlin in 2018 during the late summer, and then a year later, practically, and actually into winter, I worked on the vocals with the late David Turpin and a singer called Jordan, and we recorded. David arranged the lyrics, which were from this Jean Genet poem, and then Jordan himself sung them. So that then provided the backbone for the visuals, which I edited rather rapidly. I had a lot of footage. We'll get back onto that later when I talk about the script a bit more. But that's basically the process. And I had kind of started one place. I was constantly working on it, but it did change and twist, as you say. But
yeah. So the initial idea was the film, but I just want to kind of talk about a little bit about like how the outcome was so different from the original intention, that what was the initial discussion, you know, back in 17. And I want to kind of talk about this constant adaptation, which I think does, in a way, it's, you know, it's very rooted in your practice. Can you kind of expand on that a little bit, if you wouldn't mind?
Oh, not at all. Well, I think I'm pretty open to the twists and turns that a project takes. So I've always been really focused in on process and developing an artwork and making kind of that process quite visible along the way. It's different with this kind of project, but I think in terms of adaptation, what you might be getting at here in the question is something the way my writing techniques have evolved as well, in terms of adapting different texts and fusing different genres together. And that came from actually the first film I kind of made with Tony White, who wrote a catalogue essay for my IMA show in 2009. And he wrote this really peculiar critical piece of writing, which was a short story about a couple having an argument, and I made it into a film, which is Include Me Out of the Partisans Manifesto, it's called. But he kind of introduced me to, we connected through another curator, Hannah Firth, in Chapter, and he writes in this, it's not going to sound very peculiar, but what he does is he combines non-fiction elements and he narrativizes them. So what Rosetta was talking about earlier, he introduced me to that phrase of re-narrativization, where you're kind of turning something that's non-fiction into a story. Now, lots of writers work in this way, but what he does is he keeps rather dogmatically to the sources. So there's all these different structures that then insert themselves within the flow. And it's a literary technique really called constrained writing, which can kind of take various grammatical elements and use them as structuring devices. So that's what I've done with other films, where I've like taken text from photographs of hands and turned that into the dialogue for a movie, into a Sherlock Holmes movie, in fact. That was this film called Edward and Arnett. All available on my Vimeo channel, by the way, if you want to check it later. So with this particular project, it was fusing a Beckett short story with a Jean Genet epic poem, and those two things were never meant to be together. One was written in 1946, the other in 1954. Both released decades after they were written. The Beckett story never appeared until 1970, and the Genet poem, actually in English, only really appeared in 2003. But I managed to find the English translation eventually, because the French one is quite hard to get through. So what I was able to do with this was use the Beckett story as the narrative, the story behind this biography of Joly, and then use the Genet poem as lyrics. And I sampled both of the texts. They're not rigorous or very pretty adaptations in any sense of the word, because I'm only using bits and pieces to my own ends, because I'm telling a story about John Joly and his forgotten history and his failed love affair with Dixon. So it becomes something entirely different. And it also connects to, I guess, this thing called fan fiction, which is a particularly kind of queer writing technique as well, where you take heteronormative characters from popular culture and queer them up, and it's like Bert and Ernie are no longer just flatmates, they're lovers, for example. And there's a whole massive online genre of that, where there's major texts like Harry Potter and all the rest of it, where the characters are all flipped around, their sexuality is twisted, and very simple kind of friendships become these raging love affairs and stuff. It's rather hilarious. So with this, what that does with the Beckett text, from taking a story about a man and a woman and making it two men, the situations and the scenarios become quite charged in different ways. And that's what I kind of really liked. It matched with certain elements of the Joly biography, but it in no way kind of is massively legible or trying to be a real story. It's just another fiction on top of several other fictions in some respects.
Okay. I'm going to just kind of get off that point a little bit, and I really want to talk about the photographs. Yeah. Because just on our discussions over the last couple of weeks about prepping for this talk, you kind of refer to them as almost like they initially became like sort of a test, like a test image, test shot almost for the film. So can we talk about how they became more than that research and expanded out to become this really major part of the artwork and the projects?
Yeah, well, initially, the project was a film, and I had never intended on making photographs. I just thought they'd be too darn difficult, because the process was obviously really complicated and like a century out of use. So how the hell was I ever going to do that? But In researching around it and meeting a few great people, I met Professor Weiss Jackson from Trinity, who's actually in Joly's job, and he's writing a biography about Joly at the moment, which will eventually come out in a few years.
Mm-hmm.
And he very kindly lent me some original Joly glass plates. I did go visit the very, very large collection in the National Photography Archive, but that's really hard to access. It's not organized terribly well, and that was a bit of a pity. That just needs a lot of research money to get it in shape, but that isn't there at the moment, unfortunately. So I did a test shot with the original Joly filter, and then that kind of got me going, and I thought, oh, well, I could actually maybe make this filter. So I got a red, green, and blue line filter made as a Duraclear, which is the same kind of material that's used in light boxes, in advertising hoardings and stuff, and did a few test shots and got it to work. It was kind of not terribly scientific, but I kind of guessed around the materials and it worked. So it's rather cumbersome because you're using sheet film and large format photography and hand processing on the analog side. But the digital thing worked. I did a few different tests of sizes and it worked. And then I started working off some images that I had done for a James Merrigan publication called Madder Lake, which was this random compilation of images kind of based around Tumblr, things like that. But there was poses and there was props and stuff that were readily available. So I started using that. And I kind of liked the look of it. I basically was just a stand-in model for some test shots. Then started doing these self-portraits accidentally, and then thought that was actually a really interesting way to go. When you think about how photography is so super narcissistic now with Instagram and stuff, the self-portrait or the selfie. These are self-portraits, not selfie, because I didn't have the giant camera on the end of my arm. But it sort of fits into a lot of what photography is about, and how there's that obsession with the self and identity, and how that fits in really well as well. There's a lot of, within the self-portraits, I always generally hide most of, if not all of my face. And that also fits into a particular genre of self-portrait photography within the queer community, where people are performing, and they're like performing their identity and hiding their real identity and wearing something else. So it's not, it doesn't always have to be drag. It can be lots of other costumes and other kinds of poses and situations where you're kind of playing some other role or identity. So it fits in with that particular flow as well, which was really interesting, I thought. Got me going.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to just talk a little bit about the flower images, because what's quite interesting with that, I don't think a lot of people know, is how you collaborated on that as part of quite a large project just under the Creative Ireland umbrella. So with the flower arrangements, do you want to just expand a little bit about that? Because I think that's really interesting, just the aspect of collaboration, and it's quite an unusual one in a way.
Yeah, well, I'm super interested in different types of participation within art and within that stuff that I try to make. And I'm really, part of that is revealing the process, sharing the process, and making the process part of the artwork in some respects. And I've tried out lots and lots of different types of participatory models. Some have worked not so well, but they always tend to involve some kind of collaboration. I think filmmaking is a big collaborative effort sometimes, but you've got this big director at top. But something where there's a shared exchange of knowledge is much more interesting. So I applied for this Creative Ireland grant award and won it, which is fantastic, through Meath County Council Cultural Services. And it was to work with members of the Dunboyne Flower and Garden Club. And my mum has been a member of that for years. I've known a lot of the women involved in the club I've brought them to exhibitions, and they've helped me with some floral stuff in the past. So there was a relationship there. And the idea was to have a shared experience in some respects of me learning about flower arranging and more about flowers, and them learning about how to photograph them in this particular process, and learning about photography as well, and how framing works, composition, and so forth. And that really did kind of work. I mean, it was a great exchange that lasted over 7 months. So within the project, we had I proposed this 500-year timeline where I selected with the members these paintings from the history of art. And that's all part of this counterfactual temporality, which we may have time to talk about later, but we're going to leave it for the moment. But basically, that's just a way of describing fiction. It's sort of an art theory way of just talking about time, and how time and art are all kind of mixed up, and how you kind of address that in some way. So over 7 months, we had a workshop every week. I mean, once a month. The build up for that was kind of extensive. We had to meet 2 weeks before each workshop to identify some paintings, see what flowers were in season that would make those particular paintings doable, and then try and source as much of the flowers and floral material as possible. And that came from gardens of the members, from parks, from flower shops, from Aldi, from Lidl, wherever we could get it. There was a generous enough budget, which was great, to be able to fill my studio in Temple Bar at the time with buckets and buckets and buckets of flowers to work from. And we generally, used up almost everything that was available on the day. I felt also it was kind of important to note that I was really keen on not working with professional florists. A lot of other flower photographs that are kind of gorgeous and beautiful, it tends to be a collaboration between a professional florist and the photographer, the artist. So this was sort of a different way of working, because we had a huge amount to learn on both sides. I was busy with Louis Hall, my assistant in the photography side of things, figuring out how to get the best exposure for these pictures. And the challenge to pick apart how these arrangements, these very peculiar arrangements, worked, because their geometry is significantly and enormously different from today's flower arrangements. And so there was a lot of figuring out and a lot of duct tape and a lot of wiring to bring them to
the learning those parts.
Well, it's also like it was kind of something you forget as well working in a studio. You're only working on a very flat plane, so the flowers don't have to be seen around the back. So at the back, you've got all this support structure mess, and at the front, you've just got the beautiful flowers, so it all just looks gorgeous. In some of the photographs, I left in a bit of that kind of pipes and poles and a bit of clips and things like that to show part of that construction. And a lot of the pictures are also shot against green screen, so it kind of connects to the video a little bit, and contemporary technology, or the way you would use certain kind of backdrops in certain situations. But for the most part as well, the pictures were shot in a very non-linear, as in they weren't in historically kind of sequential kind of time. They kind of went with whatever was in season. So for example, the one that I talked about initially was in peony season, when that happens in May or June, when the shops filled with peonies.
Very short,
and I was able to get
yeah.
It is. It's a real blip. So there was a few in the history of flower paintings. There's quite a lot of full bloom rose type flower paintings and lots of peonies. So I was able to get some really specialized one from florist shops, like deep purple and then just your general white peony. They were just brilliant as fillers for certain of the 19th century flower arrangements, which they're just super lozen as a flowers, as opposed to the Dutch golden era ones, which were tulips and stuff. So we had a bit of a problem with the tulips ones, because the first session was dealing with that Dutch golden era, but the photography process went a bit banjaxed and we lost a lot of the pictures. So then the tulips went out of season rather quickly, because we started in late March. So it was already just gone over that time. So we ended up using silk tulips and for some of the other photographs, and then also painting some of them to make them darker, because there's in the tulip paintings there's the what are they called, the Rembrandt tulips, which have got this, they're the ones that from the Dutch golden era, where they were super valuable, and they've got this veiny stuff through them, and they're actually very hard to get. So I've actually ended up growing some for some workshops that unfortunately I grew some last spring, and they're coming up again now, but they were grown, I grew them for workshops. We were going to do a live Dutch golden era flower arrangement session through solstice, but that all got cancelled because of COVID, unfortunately. But
so this collaboration, it's going to be documented, isn't that correct? You're going to do like an online kind of publication around that?
Yeah, just finished actually. It should be available in the next week or two. It was designed by Uni Young. It's a kind of optically challenging PDF on screen, lots of stripes, and it has an essay by me and then comments by the participants and an introduction and stuff. So yeah, it's
and like that's going to be on your website, or
it'll be on my website and Solstice website as well. Yeah, so there'll be an email out about it.
Okay, wonderful. I just want to talk a little bit about the Paris connection, because we're under the auspices of CCI, and I want to talk about the film. and the Parisian references that are running through that, and also about some of the work that you did while on residency there that contributed towards some of the imagery for the film.
Sure. Well, I guess I started working on the script and the Beckett story in 2016 when I was on residency at CCI for a few months, which is great. And it came after the Roger Casement saga film project that I was done, so it was a really good, nice break and start on a new project right away. Well, I wanted to start on something new, but to have a residency to begin that process was brilliant. So I started, you know, picking apart the story, breaking it down into shots, and then running around Paris shooting lots and bits and pieces. So I ran around and shot scenes in the Père Lachaise cemetery and Montparnasse, and then did a lot of running up and down streets like a lunatic, filming statues and just getting bits and pieces, because it was originally supposed to be a 5-channel film, and for multi-screen projects you just need hours and hours of footage. So I was just like, and every holiday I went on, I grabbed some more stuff. So I went on holiday to Donegal briefly for a week and ran around and filmed lots of lighthouses. But the Paris and residency was super important, because I was able to then do lots of filming in the Jardin de Luxembourg, for example, of park benches. And so I had all this base material to work with. So when it came to putting the visuals together, I didn't have an edit plan until the music was finished. So I was able to edit quite quickly because I had a lot of material available. So there were certain parts of the film I didn't get around to shooting for budgetary reasons and stuff. It just part of the change of how the script evolved and warped and stuff. But Paris provided like a really strong foundation. Now, in terms of the connection with Genet and Beckett, there are connections obviously there in Paris, and Beckett is a big part of the programming in CCI and stuff. But there's no direct connections, I guess, back into the film.
Okay. We just talked about yesterday about the self-portraits, and I was reading a lot of Beckett influences in that, in terms of sort of the humor and the absurdity, and then some of those tactics and diversions of like procrastinations that runs all the way through Beckett's work. And I'm wondering, was that me just overreading Beckett into images, or was that kind of absurdity, was that consciously there when you're making those self-portraits?
You're completely overreading it, yes. That's okay.
Oh, okay. That's everything. Okay.
I mean, I think there's a connection, right? Because the absurdist humor with Beckett and the First Love story, it's an existential kind of mid-century kind of, you know, tragedy and all, you know, it's and that absurdist notion or way of working feeds into, you know, humor now, I guess. So sort of that humor still is relevant. It resonates still in lots of ways.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I'm kind of more playful around it. I'm not taking myself too seriously, but that's the fun of Beckett. He's actually hilarious. He's not.
It is hilarious. That's what it is. It's like
he's difficult, but he's also hilarious.
Yeah,
and,
like it is difficult, but it's so worth it, and it is so hilarious once you spend some sort of time with it. And I just, I was just wondering if that was conscious, but again, it just.
Well, I think also, I've got a series of photographs, and photographs don't read like a play. They don't read like a novel. They don't read like a book. You've got like, and I push lots of different references in it to try and make connections and make people think about stuff maybe, or bring stuff to it. But you've also got people's general image bank that they're just going to draw from when they see something that looks like something else. And a lot of the references might be very obscure as well. So it's not like I'm really looking for people to decode them and make those identifiers. I'm creating hopefully something new out of all these reference points. I'm just being more honest about it, or being more, I mean, revealing more of the parts that make these new things. And that's kind of what I
of course. And that was really generous in terms of how you used all those references by citing them in titling, which for someone who may sort of have this kind of conscious knowledge of something and going, where is that reference? It was really generous of you to just like kind of state it there in the titling and around the work. So that was kind of, that was really interesting kind of way of doing it, I think.
And some of them are totally made up, you know, so it's not all real. Everything's fiction, darling, so it's fine. But
okay, so I just want to talk, just gonna kind of go off subject a little bit as well. Can we talk about Joly a little bit? Because especially for me, it was a real discovery when speaking to you about Joly, because I had never heard of this scientist and maker before. So just for people who are not really aware of this figure, could you just tell us a little bit about him?
He was a super active scientist in his career. He published over 269 scientific papers and several books, and made fairly important contributions across the fields of engineering, physics, thermodynamics, color photography, botany, mineralogy, I've got a list here, geology, geophysics, teutonics, radioactivity, and geochronology, whatever that is. He was always busy, very eccentric, apparently spoke with a French accent, curiously enough, and apparently that was to hide a lisp that he had. But in 1884, he invented this method of color photography, and it was significant in the history of photography because it was the first fixed photograph, even though it was maybe a slide projection, but a fixed image that proved a color theory that had been posited earlier on in the century, in like the 1860s and even before that, which is just that you could make color, the full color spectrum out of red, green, and blue. And his process, you know, it works through light, but we'll get onto that in a little bit more. But also in 1884, he also then discovered what made sap rise through trees, and that was one of his other great discoveries that got him many accolades, and that was discovered with his collaborator Henry Horatio Dixon, who was a botany professor in Trinity. Well, the two of them had a lifelong friendship, possibly a relationship, who knows. They lived opposite each other on Temple Road in Rathgar. When Joly died, Dixon organised that his grave not be made in Offaly, where his family grave would have been, but he was buried in Mount Temple Cemetery in Harold's Cross. And when he died, he was buried with him, along with Dixon's wife. So there's rumors about their relationship being more than just professional. And I guess that's what I was curious about this sort of maybe lost love affair, as well as a forgotten scientist and a forgotten process. There's a lot of things that have been just left behind. I mean, I think he was quite successful in his career, but never successful enough to win like a Nobel Prize, so that he would be kind of counted as one of the big guys. Lots of really incredibly, like the list at the beginning, but like he had some mad experiments, like where he was trying to figure out the age of the earth based on the quantity of salt in the sea. Now the whole thing was pie-eyed, it was kind of bonkers, but he did loads of really great. He's most famously, I guess, remembered for his work in radiology, which contributed to Marie Curie. Hey, there's a French connection, because that's just around the corner from CCI as well. But in his spare time as well, what I've done, he liked to go yachting and sailing with Dixon, and they went around spotting lighthouses a lot. So that's why that like appears in the film. It's a biographical element. Nobody knows about his life. I could have made it all up, but I've just included some biographical elements. There's a lot of interesting kind of, you know, phallic imagery to do with lighthouses that I thought was rather gas, if I'm trying to imply that they had some sort of love affair that didn't work out. Who knows? I don't mean to upset anybody, hope I never did, but it's sort of out there as a kind of a rumor anyway. But it doesn't really even happen in the film. It kind of, when the love affair reaches its climax, the film shifts to text, and that was kind of I had wanted to shoot that as live action, but never got around to doing it. But I'm really happy it didn't happen, because it kind of shifts it into another kind of genre where it's just this text thing that happens. And then again, it's also just lots of staccato words that pop up with this drum and bass climax in the film. So it's even, the legibility around that is even quite difficult. And then it sort of ends, and then there's a sort of a running down the street runaway thing where it all kind of falls apart. So I don't think I really kind of hopefully offended anybody. But the Joly family have got a lot of connections through Irish culture as well. The extended family is related to the first founding collection of books in the National Library, and you know, the Joly, there's still Joly's remembered in the RDS as well, quite significantly. There's like always a table named after him in formal dinners and stuff. So he's there. He won a gold medal there. So he is remembered in some places, but not in popular memory.
Not in popular culture, in popular.
Kind of an incredible guy, yeah. I mean, the whole Joly process as well went through this tumultuous kind of few years as well, where the process was stolen by an American who, and Joly had to sue for copyright, and then he won the lawsuit, but then by the time that had resolved itself, the process had been gazumped really by the Autochrome and the Lumiere brothers, who invented that particular color process, which was also a glass plate projected image, but it was spotty rather than stripy. And I think the stripes kind of really were against him, even though I find them super attractive and super interesting as a way of presenting a different kind of photography. But I'll stop there. Go on.
I want to go back to the science of how you made these photographs, because I think that's really fascinating, and how you came to it, and the trials that had to, and the hard work and the hard-won images that are now sitting in CCI. And also, do you want to talk about just the kind of physical aspect of them and how are they made? Because I think this is really, it's very interesting for me because I'm science nerdy, but just might be interesting for everyone else, just if you want to go through that process, because they don't behave like contemporary photography as we know. They're something completely different. And even to refer to them as photographs, I think is almost, you know, a little bit like not fair. It kind of denigrates a little bit from them. So do you want to go into that process a little bit?
Well, I kind of like to describe them as slow photographs, or even anti-photographs sometimes, but they're slow because you really have to spend time figuring out what they are, because they're made of two elements, the black and white film and then the color screen, because it's not a chemical color process, it's light. It's light that's filtered on exposure and then on display. So the same film and filter that's used to take the picture is also then on display. There's no print, there's no enlargement, there's no second copy. They're all unique images, so they're kind of special. And then they could, of course, be mechanically enlarged in some way, but I really liked that smallness. The 4x5 sheet film size is large, but it's still tiny compared to the general trends in photography are for giant prints, huge murals. I've done that stuff too in the past, but it's rare you see something small and precise. And I also didn't want to just sort of luxuriate in this alternative process and weirdness of it all, but create something that was a bit more sculptural in its presentation. I've made them with these light boxes, I suppose, but they're exposed, that the sides are open, so the light spills out of the side, and they're made with these metal profiles that are actually from metal windows that are made in Switzerland through an Irish company here, that I got them to sew up some profiles that enable the picture, which is of 3 acrylic elements, to pull out a couple of centimeters away from the wall, and then it's lit by a tiny flat LED panel, which is actually used for bathroom lighting. So it exposes the layers of the picture in its construction to sort of bring attention to the fact that it is a different type of image. If it was all closed in, you'd have all these little tiny pictures, little blips on a wall, but the way with the light spilling from the sides, it becomes quite three-dimensional, and there's a different type of thing that happens. And then the sequencing of them as well is also different. But I think that's it around the pictures without getting too complicated. It's a tricky process because it's, you know, mostly analog, so you're mixing chemicals in a bucket and hoping that everything works out. And we went through a few different, quite a lot of trial and error of just temperature and freshness of the chemistry for it to work perfectly. So we have it down now, thanks to Louis Hall, of course, who's my photo genius friend. Is that it? Is that enough? I could go on about it for hours, but I won't, I swear.
But I think what's like, talk to me about, like, as the viewer, when you come across these objects, because with the light spilling, they kind of create this, they're quite, you need to work to have the image, to reveal the image in a way as the viewer. So you do cleanly have to work a little.
Yeah, the picture only really becomes a photograph without lines about 2 meters away. And then when you go closer to it, it breaks down into lines. And the construction of it, I found, it really fascinatingly, really invites people in to look. Like, there's loads of people I've seen at exhibitions with their faces stuck to the wall looking behind it. And it kind of and it invites this invitation. And then that's really great because there's 2 layers, the color strips go out of alignment really easy, because the color is burned into the black and white film in only one place. So because of the thickness of the 2 layers, they go off, and then you get this sort of shift in color. So purples become greens just when you move sideways from here to here. And it creates this sort of analog interactive element to it. And it's very like a lenticular image, but that's the moving eyes in a saint painting or something like that. But that has a grooved surface where there's different pictures printed on different grooves, so that allows multiple pictures to happen. This is the same picture, but the color shifts. So in the self-portraits, I kind of I try to exploit that as much as I could, that's the word, because it only really is very obvious in large color blocks. So I was looking, there's like a pink t-shirt and green shorts, for example. So and actually the green flips to purple, and then there's another color that kind of flips as well. So it's in the flower photographs, you get more of a twinkle where the colors are kind of smattering around, and then the white, of course, never really changes that much. And it's remarkable. White's always blows my mind as well, because white comes through the red, green, and blue stripes, because the whole image is, it is just made up of these red, green, and blue stripes that are then just silhouetted by the black and white film behind to make the color. And it's a magical kind of process. And it brings back some of the magic of photography that I kind of lost by studying it too much over the years. And I kind of began in photography, gave it up for a couple of decades, and came back to it now. So it's kind of restored some faith for me in it, and given me a little enclave within photography that I can kind of call my own, because I don't know if many other people do the Joly process. I've heard of one other person trying it out somewhere, but
somewhere, maybe at some stage. I don't really want to talk about our pandemic world, but I think everyone's kind of going through the same thing. And can we just talk about that pivot that you needed to make around the shows? Because obviously, for the whole of last year, there were planned showings of all this work throughout Ireland and also abroad. And I just want to talk about that the changes that you needed to make to your schedule, but also to how the installation would have almost worked. Because when we showed the work in RHA, it was very much, different pairings and different ways that they worked within the space. But then obviously when things changed, and there was the need to bring in physical distancing and to have that aspect in everything that you do as a gallerist or as a curator. And can you just talk a little bit about that and how you adapted to it and the difficulties around it for someone who had a really, really packed year that was really disturbed by the things that were happening? Everyone's world was being a little bit disturbed. Can we just talk about maybe that act, or that, like, how you kind of coped with that?
Well, it was a mess the year for everybody. But so I'd been on like a big production binge in 2019, and then had scheduled a bunch of shows quite miraculously. It was never a tour, but it was a collaboration between Void and CCI and the RHA in terms of them coming together to share the work. But we didn't get all these touring and grants and stuff like that. We kind of did it on our own steam. And the body of work itself, there was maybe about 50 odd photographs, but there's quite a small amount, and I'm actually only ever interested in showing them in small quantities, but like between 10 and 15, because they're so intense, and I want to keep that intensity rather than flood the place with thousands of pictures to look at. And like the RHA, they were big galleries, and we showed, like, was it 18 or? I think it was 18 altogether, and then there was the triptych. There was a triptych in the room where the film is, and then a diptych. So it was really very, very sparse. But because obviously all the light was gone and the floor was darkened, so they almost kind of felt like they kind of floated in this very, very, the ceilings kind of were brought down as well. That was very interesting. But I think what also the and in CCI there's 15. There was a different, what happened anyway was that there was a few shows that were cancelled. There was a few other smaller shows in between and group exhibitions that actually haven't been rescheduled. Some have, some haven't. But during the course of the year, and with the rolling lockdowns and rolling kind of openings and closings of public spaces, I had to kind of just rearrange the selection of the shows constantly. So I had these folders of little thumbnail pictures that I had constantly out on the kitchen table that was driving Noel crazy, because it was just like, make up your mind, what are you going to show? And I'm like, can't decide until I know what's available for what venue at what time. So there was some overlaps. There was some that were on their own, and then they came and fell apart and fell together again, and it was all very hilarious. But and so in the end, I kind of wanted to show like my favorite photographs from the series in Paris, and that, because Paris was the last slot away from everybody else on its own, so that was going to be clear. But in the end, then it clashed with the show in Derry. And there's been an overlap in that, and then as it turned out, I had to send the stuff to Paris in August or September after the RHA, and then it got hung in November, and then it wasn't open till January. It was kind of nuts. So I ended up shooting new stuff for Derry, which was great because that had a very different type of flavor to the show with the film, and then some other sculpture and installation elements, and then an AOR element and a fragrance. And it was really focused on the hyacinth motif within the narrative, which reoccurs. But I was able to really expand on that. And then that works then further again as a sculpture that's going to be made in a park this spring sometime, COVID dependent as well. So it was fun trying to figure it out, frustrating, but kind of great to get these sequences. And then initially in the OHA, they were in little triptychs in sets of 3 as a way of working together the different genres. So there was a flower, maybe an object, and a self-portrait together, and to create a certain kind of dynamic or narrative. That then was like kind of impossible after that for Derry and then Paris, where they're in longer linear kind of sequences, spacing them out to give people more room around the pictures. Now, galleries have not been overwhelmed. It's been brilliant to have the show open in Paris. It's been brilliant that it was connected to the PhotoSaintGermain festival, so there was an audience in the locality running around galleries and stuff, because I found it really hard not really hard, really difficult, but that the audiences have just been so slow and unwilling to come out for loads of obvious reasons. And even when, like, the show in the OHA was up for a month and then on the walls for 6 months afterwards in a dark room, and then it opened up for 2 weekends and it was gone. So there was one busy weekend and one bank holiday weekend, so it's a bit of a shame, but it's been interesting. I've been really honored to be so busy during the year. Most people were just struggling and paralyzed, and I've been sort of kept busy by rescheduling all these exhibitions, which has been something to do. And then it's just been great to have the support from all these institutions as well along the way, because you know, for the most part, nobody let me down, and a lot of the galleries have kept their commitments, and that's just been great, and struggled on. So
I think I mean, the concern obviously for the next sort of year is to try and get gallery attendances back to some sort of way they were before, because there's a lot of research done, especially in the UK, and they've gone from, you know, people would generally go, 25% of people would generally go once a month to a gallery. It's now gone down to 4% because of all the obvious reasons. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there in the, you know, the museum and gallery sector, is to really expand and to stress the fact that they are safe spaces. They are they're very roomy spaces, and they're very welcoming spaces. So hopefully that the attendance will get better. But of course, obviously, there's also the online audiences as well that we also need to be really, really aware of. And that's opened up an awful lot of sort of potential for
I forgot to mention that, yes, because all my photographs are online, so you can see the show on my website, alanphelan.com, and the other sequences of photographs that were in the other exhibitions, I've put them online, as well as like the English translation from the review we got from La Libération, which was fantastic.
Oh, great.
It's super hard to read in English because it's really poetic, but it's a really fab review, and I've made my best attempt at translating it with the help of lots of friends through Facebook, actually. Crowdsourced translation.
Great. I'm just looking at our time, Alan. So listen, there's a couple of questions that have come in on the chat, if you'd be happy enough to kind of go through that. There's one here, excuse me, I'm just going to read it out from the screen. Question here about Joly being a forgotten Irish scientist. Obviously, so groundbreaking with the photographic work, but also the other work he did. And this person's wondering why we did that in the past as a nation, refused to recognise a person like Joly, who was really a mover in terms of progress. And it also applies to writing and art, of course. And this person would love to know what you think about that.
I think he just didn't really make a big enough scientific discoveries. He was just a hard-working scientist who experimented in so many different disciplines that maybe his focus just wasn't successful enough, even though he did, you know, figure out the water cohesion theory, which is the big discovery of why sap, you know, rises through trees, because it's all about the water molecule and its and the nature of the water molecule itself. So that was quite a big discovery. But again, it's like what I said earlier, it's just not a Nobel Prize winning thing. And he made significant contributions to a number of different genres, but not enough. And I don't know why that gets forgotten. I think it's really interesting most of us get forgotten. It's like not very many of us get remembered. So it's sort of bringing attention to that in terms of following somebody who is fascinating, who is, you know, rendered insignificant by history, and that's the tragedy of it all. It's too many of us humans now, damn it. It sort of brings a certain pathos to an understanding that we're all, you know, part of a giant number of people who can maybe all do brilliant things, but there isn't room for everybody. It's just a bit sad. Does that answer the question, Anne?
Yeah, I think so. Just another one here. Could you just remind, someone was wondering about the Beckett text. Which text was the Beckett text that you referred to?
It's a short story called First Love.
Yeah.
And it's generally performed as well as a solo, male solo performance. And I did work with one actor, his name escapes, Marcus Lamb, who read the, we had a reading before the lockdown in the RHA of the Genet.
Wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it was just like literally the week before, because we were supposed to have a dance event that had to get cancelled tragically, which was going to be this mad voguing event, which is going to be super cool. But anyway, the Beckett text, as it's performed, it's quite a misogynistic text, I found. It's a very peculiar for Beckett to be so woman-hating in a way, but maybe that's, I don't really consider him that bad of a person, but this particular text is rather poor. It's like, you know, about a guy meeting a prostitute in a park, moving in with her, watching her doing her, you know, business, and then getting her pregnant and running away. It's really quite cruel, but it's partially kind of autobiographical. Apparently he did father a child with a prostitute during the war, blah blah blah. Who knows? There's a rumor about that, but it's not necessarily 100%. And because that's the notion of the story is, and I found it really interesting that with talking with Marcus and other general reading around the story, it's generally seen that the reason why this guy is so screwed up is because his mother is absent. And I found that really peculiar, because in my reading of it, it's the father who locks the son in the room and abandons him, and it creates this psychological kind of trauma that's then reenacted in adulthood, where he locks himself away in a room and barricades him away from Lucy, the prostitute. And so it's the father that's the problem. And the story opens up with him pissing on the grave of his father in a cemetery. So he has all these daddy issues, not mommy issues. Yeah. And that was kind of what I really wanted to kind of concentrate on, like where the boy is locked in a room as a child, and he tends to tomato plants and dying hyacinths. That's only like a small part of a paragraph in the story, and Marcus was like really interested in how I picked that out of the whole story, because other people tend to focus on other parts of the narrative, and then it's also that dreadful absence of the mother who's blamed for all the problems, which is just ridiculous. And that's where the misogyny really kicks in terms of the reading of it. But as a text, it's really, really visual. And I was really drawn to it because it was the first book that my future husband gave me, actually, as a first edition. And it's like the most twisted story you could give someone as a gift. So like, here's a story called First Love, but it's really anything but. It's the most tragic, screwed up story of a relationship you could possibly imagine. So that was quite an interesting gift, and it was sort of lying on a bookshelf for years. But I just kind of picked it out and decided I'd do something with it. And as a story anyway, it's really fascinating because it's very, very visual. There's tons of imagery. There's all this kind of vegetables, hyacinths and parsnips and violets. It's really smells and fragrances and damp moss and rotten and nettles and all that stuff. So that's why there's all these things appear in the film in a way as well. And there's that weird sequence where he's drawing names in cow poo and barn and stuff. So it's a really bonkers story once you sort of take parts of it, and then actually I didn't re-sequence in the same sequence as the story in lots of ways. There's tons missing, but it's the same kind of sequence. And that dream sequence actually became was one of the questions that one of those journalists asked Rosetta last week that confounded her, because I had to explain, it's in the story and it's a bit weird, but it's a kind of a dream sequence, and the music shifts to a kind of a twinkle twinkle at that point as well, where it isn't something that necessarily happened. And that was again, that was actually done in a NCAD, in the big green screen studio. Me rolling around in a coat, pretending to be Joly, having a moment. I shouldn't have said that. Yeah, I'm in the film as well. But,
cool. Cool.
In disguise.
I'm just thinking now, I don't have any more questions for you to answer.
I see one. Who played the drum and bass?
Oh, sorry, I didn't get to that. Apologies.
So the drum and bass was part of the music from that was written by Ian McInerney and James Kelly. So it was just something, when I was working on the composition of the music, I had we weren't working off the script specifically, but we were working off moods. So there's sort of a sad opener that builds to a climax, and that's the drum and bass climax. So we kind of worked, that's what ended up happening. So it was James Kelly doing the drum and bass.
Cool.
In Alex in LA.
Is there anything else? I'm just kind of conscious of time. It's almost 8. Is there anything else you want to kind of discuss before we all head off and have some dinner? In our own homes, obviously.
Well, I just hope that lots of people can get in to see it. And the next run of the show, if you're interested in seeing more of it, there's an exhibition that's going to be in the Molesworth Gallery in Dublin in March, which is kind of fantastic and great to have on. And it's all COVID restriction dependent, of course, but it's going to be just the flower photographs, and it's a new selection of flower photographs that haven't been seen, because the ones that are in Paris will still be in Paris in March, or they'll be on their way back, I guess. So there's quite a lot of the flower photographs that haven't been shown, so that's kind of exciting to get more of the work out there. And
are you using both rooms in the Molesworth? It's upstairs and
it's just the upstairs.
Just the upstairs. Okay. Right. Yeah, another architectural space to get used to, because that's quite an interesting. Yeah.
Well, it's got lots of paneling, wood paneling. So actually the pictures fit quite beautifully between all these panels, actually. So that should be quite nice. It'll just depend on how many. It'll be about 10 or 15, but we'll see.
And that's March.
That March through to the end of April, hopefully.
Okay.
But we'll see. It depends on how things open up and stuff. But it'll be probably available for private view anyway. I mean, by appointment, if it's not open to the public, if people really want to get in and see it.
Looking forward to seeing those, because there'll be some works I haven't seen, so that's great. Okay, so
thank you everybody for saying thank you.
Yeah, lovely thank yous. Thank you everyone for coming. That's great. Yeah, just saying if there's anything else here. Nope, that's great. I'm just wondering,
does Nora want to say goodbye? Hello?
Does Nora want to say goodbye, or Rosetta? Do you want to jump in?
Yes.
Okay. Do you have a question?
I don't have a question, because you've answered so many wonderful things. In fact, I'm going to re-listen to the technical side, because that is something that people do ask, and it's as a non-photographer, it's quite difficult to explain.
2 sheets. 2 elements, that's the main thing. It's made of 2 elements. You're looking at 2 things that are lined up to make the color, and it's light, not chemistry. And that's really as simple as it should be. It's a real mind bender for so many people, because we're so used to just seeing a print that sort of, doesn't reflect light, doesn't transmit through. So it's actually quite difficult to understand what it is you're seeing. I even talked to an artist today in London who works in light and color, and she can't get her head around them either. So it's really, I mean, I love that about it, that they're actually something that is just a photograph, but it's so not. It's so much more. So that's kind of cool.
Well, they're magical. And it's been really interesting. And thank you very much, both of you,
thanks for hosting.
Such a great insight, as people have been saying. And très, très bonne soirée à tout le monde.
Okay. Merci beaucoup.
De rien.